off on the chaordic stepping stone. So remember we had a chaos and order, that was the chaordic path. Well, there are specific stepping stones that you walk to actually walk the chaordic path. And these are most of them, about 70% of them. We're just going to apply them to good meetings. And so when you have, you have your meeting, right? You're thinking about it, what's happening at your meeting. One of the first things to consider is the context you're meeting in, right? And I know that sounds silly, but every meeting has a specific context, right? You need to think about and often it's an invisible context to us, right? But it's worth just being explicit about what's the actual context you're in. What's the larger picture you're working in? So some of us just talked about the scope of asking questions. And so it's worth thinking, like, what's one scale out from where you're working? And look at the larger picture. Are you in a time of budget cuts? Are you in a time where there's been a lot of change? I was just working with someone last week where the person had been moved off of the very senior leadership team to now running a department. This was a major shift. And she'd gone from running a department of about 25 people to a department of 4 people. People had always been under her, but now she was like in the cubicle next to them, right? That's just a larger picture. Like, you can't run a staff meeting without knowing some of that big picture stuff. Are we at a time of, an outbreak of some kind? Like, what's the larger picture we're in? It's worth considering so that we don't just kind of begin to do rote meetings. Is this meeting a standalone? Is it a series of meetings? Or is it a regular meeting, right? So is it a meeting for a specific purpose? That's, and you're just going to meet one time and get this done. That's a whole different kind of design. If it's a series of meetings, we're going to meet over the next 6 months about this particular thing, and how I design meeting 1 and how I design meeting 15 is really different, right? So is it a series of meetings going to a certain place? Is it an ongoing meeting, right? That's a whole different kind of design. I might have things I talk about every time. I might have agreements we make about that, right? So you just need to think about what kind of meeting you think about the context. Where are you in the meeting kind of life cycle? Opening meetings to generate ideas are really quite different from meetings 6 months later. Like, how are we going to make these ideas real? How are we going to budget it? What's the timeline? You know what I mean? Like, those are just different kinds of meetings. They take different kinds of design. What are the parameters going into the meeting? Are there things that the group should know as you go in? So we were involved, Deb and I were involved in redesigning the adult homeless system here in town. So we needed a complete kind of crisis system overhaul. And one of the parameters was there was not going to be new money or new beds given. So yes, redesign the entire system, but don't ask for more money and don't say we need more beds for homeless folks. Like, that's not going to happen. It's a parameter. And so sometimes we're afraid to give those parameters up front because we think that people are just so mad that they want to go with us. Where before, there's some mad people. But it's much kinder to tell those parameters up front than let people design something and then tell them no, right? And so get really clear on your parameters. And I found that often senior leaders want to kind of say, well, let's just see what happens, right? And then we'll figure out what the parameters are. That's a pretty dangerous thing to do because you can make people really mad, right? And often senior leaders are so in their positions, they know what the parameters are. They're not even thinking about how to be explicit about them. So we do a lot of pushing. What do you already know? What's off the table? What's not possible? What could never get funded in this community, right? They're realistic questions. It's not to decrease people's creativity. It's to not set them up to fail. And so get really clear on the parameters. Get really clear on decision-making ability. So is this a group that you're consulting for advice on what should happen, or is this the group that actually can decide it's going to happen and implement it, right? Just get really clear on who's making decisions around what happens out of the meeting. And it's okay if it's you. It's okay if it's you, right? I'm going to take this and talk with some other folks and then I'll decide what's going to happen. Not everything has to be collective. Certainly not everything has to be consensus to do things in a participatory way. There is a place for hierarchy, and sometimes even if hierarchy isn't the best place for it, that's how you're set up and that's how it's going to happen, right? And so just getting really clear about where decision-making power lies, who's making decisions, how they're made. So with this homelessness project, we had like this huge sheet of paper that said kind of these decisions are made by this group, these decisions are made by this group, these decisions are made by this group. Don't try to make decisions outside of your group, because actually, we have some federal laws here, right? It's not, it's not even people just wanting to be in control. It's we actually have laws around it. So know your context, right? The context might be history, right? I'm working with a group right now that the history has been, for this particular group, that they have been a pretty homogenous, not diverse group, and they're really trying to become more diverse. And they've had some real blow-ups around that. And so not to know that history as I went in the room would not have helped me on a good meeting. So know your context. And then, of course, once you're clear on your context that you're in, first thing, we began to talk about this, is what's the need for the meeting, right? So often we meet because we always meet on Thursday mornings, or we often meet on, we meet once a month, and that's what we do. But getting really clear on what's the need for this particular meeting, even if it's an ongoing meeting. Really dialing into what is the need for this meeting. And the need might be very obvious. We're an office and we need to communicate with each other. That's a great ongoing need to have. But you might want to say, like, this week, what's the need for this meeting, so that you can really be clear on things like that. I also think sometimes there's more of an ecosystem of need than we typically think of. Like, we tend to think about the need of the people in the meeting, but there might be needs of people who are outside the meeting for the meeting. There might be needs of patients for the meeting. Like, it's worth thinking kind of like who all might care about this meeting and what's their need. So for some folks, in some projects, we'll do something called a calling question. And that's the question that is really clear about the need. What was the calling question for optimal health?
You asked it. Can we provide affordable, sustainable care for our community?
So that was kind of a calling question. People had some sense of why they were coming to that meeting, what the need was. Not every meeting has a calling question. I tend to think about it more when you're trying to bring in kind of multiple stakeholders to kind of see some, but either way, getting really clear on the need. Once you're clear on the need, so let's just say around the need, might be a calling question. But the real thing around that is you want to get to the real need. You don't want to make assumptions about that need. And then we get to purpose. What's the purpose of the actual meeting that you're having? And that should be, once you're clear on need, the purpose should flow, right? It's not divorced from the need. The purpose of the meeting should go directly from your need, and everything in the meeting should go to that purpose, right? So we're not asking extraneous questions. So sometimes people say, like, well, just, ask a question to get people going, and then we'll get into the meeting. And it's not awesome to think about the check-in question that way, because the check-in question can actually do some real work. But if you're thinking about the purpose, you want to be really clear here, and you want to share that with people. Like I said, I send it out in an email ahead of time. I have it at the top of all of my agendas. I announce it at the outset of the meeting. This is why we're here today. Helps us when we start to go off on tangents. Okay, does that bring us? Is that part of what we're here to do? Helps kind of bring people in. And I tend to think about purpose having two components. One is the work to get done, and the other is your relationships, right? So there's always work to get done in a meeting, and so naming that right up front. But the other reason we meet in this way is that we believe that relationships and how we are together matters as much as what we're doing. So I almost always have a purpose in there around building our relationships. So with this group last week, I said the purpose is to identify our next level of strategic work as a group, Our purpose then is to operationalize that work. What does that mean in real life? And then our third purpose was to build our relationships so we can deliver on that mandate, right? So there was something about, and I almost always have relationships to get our work done as part of our purpose, so that people aren't like, well, why are we just chatting about this? Well, the purpose is to build our relationships so we can, right? Why are we doing a check-in? Because we need to build our relationships so we can do better work. And so those two pieces almost are always in my purpose, and just having some real clear statement of purpose. The next bit of work are the people, right? So we've gotten clear on the need, we've gotten clear on the purpose of the meeting. Who are the people who need to be at the meeting? Like, who needs to be here with us? And it might be the usual suspects, and that's cool. You don't necessarily have to go beyond that. But if you want to try something new or do something different or push boundaries, the question of who else is a good one to ask. Who else needs to be here? Who else might care about it? I said in the last group, who are we scared to invite to this meeting? That doesn't mean we should invite them. It just means we should consider. Who are we scared to invite and why, maybe? But also, is there a time when we do want to invite them? I don't actually think it's a great idea strategically to invite people who are going to blow things up and don't like any of our ideas to our very first or second meeting. Right? Like, that might not be the meeting, but it doesn't mean in our series of 8 meetings they're never going to be invited. Right? It doesn't mean we don't engage them in other ways. And so that who else question tells you who might need to be in the room, but it also might tell you what the work is outside of the room to do. And it's worth asking in a really rigorous way, because there's almost always someone who brings in a dissonant viewpoint that might not be what we want to hear, but may actually bring value, right?
I was chuckling. I was in Vienna. I was in Alpbach, this somewhere in Austria, and we were doing this design process. And I was sitting with a woman who was designing a workshop that they were bringing in these scientists from all over Europe around the question, what would it take to create happy cities that were environmentally sustainable, something like that. And she was talking about the people, we're on the people question. And she was listing all these scientists and all these people that she was going to bring in. She was a Russian environmental scientist working in Berlin. And as we're going through it, I said, well, what would happen if you invited citizens to come into this workshop? She started to stutter. I said, you don't have to, but... and I said, just consider it. Just consider it. It might add a particularly important dimension to happy cities. And so we went on, we did the work, and she came up to me at the end of the day and she said, I'm going to try it. I'm going to see if we can't get citizens to come into this meeting. Prior to that question being asked, it was going to be just scientists that were going to be in this conversation about citizens.
And we do that all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. We say we want to affect this group of people, and that group doesn't have any voice in our. And I'm not saying that all the meetings aren't, like for this homelessness work, we didn't have folks who were homeless into every part of it, but we did have those voices in, right? At some point, like who and who else? There's a quick saying, if it's about us, don't do it without us, right? That's like, but we do that all the time. We consider people all the time and then don't invite them to have.
Do you run the risk of people that you would normally have at a meeting, if you subset a meeting off, that they're not invited, right? You meet with the people that you select, there are ramifications of, hey, you guys met, but I wasn't invited. Is there any potentiality for angst or any type of, misconception that you met without me or trying to do something behind my back?
My experience with human beings is there's always opportunities for angst and miscommunication. Just truly, even with the best, purest intentions. And so when I can, when it's possible, I try to lay out what's going to happen for the next bit of time to people. Okay, so we're going to have a stakeholder meeting here. You're invited. We're going to have our meeting here. And I try to let people know what's happening, so there's a little bit of transparency up front when I can see it. And I think for me, especially if it's stakeholders around an issue, I always invite what we call the core team, the core group to be in that meeting. Often they don't choose to come, but they've been invited, so it doesn't feel like it's a separate. But it's, you know, the more transparent you can be and then still expect miscommunication and misunderstanding. And then also too, the other thing is to bring the harvest from that meeting that you had separate back into, you might even want to front load your next meeting with that other group with that. Okay, so we had this meeting, want to make sure you know about that, you know. It's hard. It's, and then after you have what you need purpose and who's coming, you want to design the meeting, right? You want to think about, you know, so kind of big buckets, right? You want to check in, you want to check out, and in between is what are you going to do, right? What do you have time to do? You need to decide the methodology. I think there was an open space yesterday on what's the appropriate methodology. And just to be clear, I should probably put, I mean, your purpose is driving all of this, right? So you don't just pick a methodology because it sounds like a fun methodology. You pick the methodology that works for your purpose, right? So if your purpose is to get some sense of what the group is thinking about a specific issue, cafe might be a great, circle might be a great way. If your purpose is to get some work done on an issue, open space might be a great way. So you pick the methodology based on purpose and the content, right? So choose your methodology.
Or methodologies.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And then, this could go back and forth. With your methodologies, you have to pick the right questions, right? So what are the questions you want to ask? And I would just say, for longer term, like if I'm thinking about working on something, as I've heard some of you talking about, if I'm thinking about working on something for the next 6 months, often what guides that is I'll have an initial meeting where we say, what are the questions we need to answer in the next 6 months, right? And then we'll actually lay the questions out on a timeline. Okay, so if we've got 6 months, we're meeting once a month, these are the 12 questions or 18 questions, these 3 will go in this meeting, and so people actually see the path that we're gonna go on based on the questions we're asking. But whenever you pick the methodology, choose the right questions for it, right? And so with cafe, you can't ask many questions, right? Usually 3, maybe 4 is max. Circle, if you want to do an in-depth circle, you might pass the piece twice. You know, like that's a lot for people. So you always, my experience is that you always have less questions than you want to ask. You usually have less time you have time for less questions than you want to ask. So think about your time and think about what people can tolerate. If it's an hour and a half meeting and half an hour and 45-minute check-in is not going to work, right? Like, just got to think about it. And so I'm a big fan of timed agendas. We don't have one here. We do have one, but we didn't put it up on the wall. But often I'll give that to people. This is what we're hoping to move through so that we can keep ourselves to it. And I'm not the only person noticing that. But timing is quite important. But you often need more time than you think you're going to. Right? So just to kind of name that. I always check my questions back to the purpose. Does that question get us back to what we're trying to achieve? If not, it doesn't go in. If it's just an interesting question, if it's just a nice side conversation, it's something we should ask, but it doesn't go to the purpose. Like there are lots of really important questions that you just can't have in a meeting, right? Maybe they go to another meeting or maybe they're someplace else, but when you're clear on purpose, that gives you kind of your first level filter for is this the right kind of question. Once you've got your design or as you're designing, you want to think about harvest. What is it that, how are you going to make meaning? This is like the sense making from your meeting. What is the sense making you're going to take? What do you need to actually leave with? What's the tangible harvest, right? So almost always in my design before checkout, right here, I'm being really explicit about next steps. So people don't leave unclear about what we agreed to do next, right? So it's that, okay, and as I'm leading the meeting, I'm often capturing next steps up. And before we leave, I'm saying, okay, this is part of the harvest, right? This is what I think we agreed on as next steps. Got it? Everybody got, so that so that people don't leave the meeting going, what just happened there? And what did we say we were gonna do? And, you know, like, so next steps as a harvest is part of the sense making. That's a tangible. If there are things to do after the meeting, if there are agreements that have been made, recapping those, that's an important part of the sense making. And then there's also the intangible, right? Like, and you might get a sense of that, or you might, like, you know, a good checkout question is, what's different for me than when this meeting began, right? So you can get a little bit of a temperature check. Sometimes we'll ask about weather reports. What's your weather report now? It came in kind of cloudy, and now it's like less cloudy. So, right, just gives you a little temperature check. The sense making, you need to think as you go through each methodology, how you're going to collect the information, how you're going to make sense with it, and who will you share it with. And so, before I go to who will you share it with, the sense making, as much as possible, if you can make that not just you doing it. Because what can happen with harvesting is it can begin to feel like note-taking or kind of an admin job. And I see harvesting really differently. I think harvesting is a really powerful role because I'm taking what you said and making sense of it, right? And so if I care about something deeply, I'm going to harvest it, right? Because I don't know what sense you're going to make of it, but I need to make sense of it. So to keep me honest, it's really good to do it with someone. So it's not just me harvesting because my lens will come through really strongly. So, right, history is written by the victors. That is true around harvesting, right? Like, it's actually true. You can shift what was put on a wall and post-its into kind of whatever you want it to mean, right? So keep yourself honest. That's why it's good to make sense in the meeting and verbalize that in front of people so that you can check it. Like, okay, this is how I'm making sense of that. Does that make sense to you? And people will tell you if it does or not. And then it's not just you making sense of it. And then if you can have someone help you work with it, that helps with some of that kind of power piece. Because it actually is a pretty powerful role. And then when we relegate it to note-taking or to kind of an admin piece, it's less likely that we'll learn from it. It's less likely that we'll use it. And it's less likely that we'll actually have made sense of what we talked about. That becomes when we have to learn what we learned together, right? When we make it visible, when we share it back with people, when we bring it into the next meeting, that's when it actually becomes alive and we learn from what we've done. And then think about who you'll share it with. Not everyone needs to know what you did. Some people do want to know. There's different levels of harvest. You might give the detailed notes, like our website that we're creating for this. Like, it's not going to be all that meaningful for anybody but people in this room, right? To the funders, we might do a right above, this weekend or this program that has a few things from it, but we're not going to kind of give the whole shebang because it's actually not meaningful to them. So we share it with what's meaningful to them, what's the media they want to receive it in, how do they receive information, who's the best deliverer of that information, all those things. And finally, went over this some, right? But what are the next steps? And I just have that every single meeting. Just what did we agree to, and then my own facilitator next steps. Because there's a content next steps that people might agree to, but what do I do next to make sure people feel like the meeting was useful and want to come back to my meetings, right? Clear about what happened there. Send a harvest pretty quickly. I make sure that what we did in this meeting carries into the next meeting so people don't feel like they're doing things over. So there are a whole set of next steps from the people at the meeting, and there's a whole set of next steps from me as a facilitator at the meeting. So that's kind of, if I'm thinking about designing a meeting, I have to know the context, I have to be clear on the need, clear purpose, invite the right people, have good methodology, and realistic timing with good questions. How do I make sense of the meeting, and then what are next steps? That's meetings in a nutshell. What? Any questions? I just downloaded a fire hose, so any questions about that? Ready for lunch?
So it's 12:25. Let's come back here at 1:15.